Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Today we're talking about a new proposal to criminalize Holocaust denial in Canada. Holocaust denial is one of the worst forms of anti-Semitism. It's disgusting, a lie, and should be condemned by society for the vicious falsehood that it is. But should it be criminalized? The federal government is set to make it a criminal offense to make a statement denying that the Holocaust took place or condoning or downplaying the killing of Jews by the Nazis, except in private conversation. The proposal is now part of the federal Liberal budget after being originally proposed as a private member's bill by a Conservative MP. Along with the new proposed crime, the budget sets aside $70 million for initiatives benefiting Canada's Jewish community. Here today to discuss the new proposed crime of Holocaust denial are two experts. Joanna Barron is the Executive Director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, the same charity that I work for, and Professor Richard Moon is a professor at the University of Windsor Law School. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Joanna, let's start with you. What exactly is this proposal? What exactly is being criminalized? What detail can you add?
So the proposed bill amends the criminal code provisions dealing with criminal hate speech, and it criminalizes prohibiting the willful promotion of anti-Semitism through condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust, as you mentioned.
Professor Moon, anything you want to add to that? What are the penalties under this law, proposed law?
Well, yes, I understand it. The penalty will be the same as the current penalty under the willful promotion of hatred law, with a maximum penalty of imprisonment for 2 years, that being a maximum.
So, Joanna, this is contained in the federal budget. It was originally proposed as a private member's bill. Why is it in the budget? It's adding a criminal code offense. It's not a spending commitment. So why would it be in there?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a question that Senator Denise Batters asked me when I testified before Senate committee this week about this bill. And, it seems to be to sort of avoid, attention, and there may be some political strategic calculations that maybe we'll talk about later. Although in this instance, as you mentioned, we also know that a pretty much identical iteration of this bill was tabled as a private member's bill by the Conservative MP earlier this year.
Professor Moon, any thoughts on whether this law should be in the budget? Is it typical to include changes to criminal code in the budget, or is this kind of an anomaly?
Well, I have to say I have no particular expertise in this. I'm aware that increasingly different things are included in omnibus bills and so forth, and there's some criticism of that, but I don't know the exact strategy or thinking that went into including this in the budget bill.
Joanna, so you recently testified at Senate committee hearing opposing the adding of this as a criminal code offense. What's the argument against criminalizing Holocaust denial?
Well, before I get into the arguments, I want to just say that I am a descendant of two Holocaust survivors. My grandmother and grandfather. My grandmother was in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, and so pretty much my earliest memory has been having it instilled in me that these atrocities happened and that we should never forget. In terms of the law, this proposed law is superfluous. Holocaust denial that willfully promotes hatred against Jews, including presumably by way of Holocaust denial, is already illegal. It's already a crime under Section 319 sub 2 of the Criminal Code, which says that anybody who publicly communicates hatred against any group is guilty of an indictable offense. And it's also likely a violation of Section 2B of the Charter, the right to free expression. And we know that from Zundel, which was a Supreme Court of Canada case from nearly 30 years ago concerning a notorious Holocaust denier who did things like put out pamphlets saying, "Did 6 million really die?" that even the most repugnant speech is indeed protected under Section 2B.
Professor Moon, I want to get to the same question, your view on the law, whether you support it. We've only got 30 seconds left in this segment, but I think, so I'll let you answer in the next segment, but I think I want to speak for all of us when we all say, no matter our view on criminalizing Holocaust denial, we all abhor this type of speech. It's vile speech. It's terrible speech. It's speech that we as a society should condemn. And this is all a very separate issue of whether or not that speech should also be criminalized. So when we come back from this commercial break, Professor Moon, I want to get your take, your perspective on whether adding this to the criminal code is a good thing or a bad thing. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we are discussing a new proposal in the federal budget to criminalize Holocaust denial, which is abhorrent speech. But the question is, should it be criminal speech as well? Professor Moon, what is your view? Do you support the idea of criminalizing this type of speech or not?
Well, I mean, I support criminalizing hate speech. My question really is, what is this particular law meant to do? Is it simply redundant? Is it already covered in effect by the existing hate speech provision in the criminal code, the willful promotion of hatred against identifiable groups? Or does it add something? And if it adds something, I'm not sure what it adds. And I think that's important for us to get a sense of. I agree that I think Holocaust denial is, in most instances, probably already covered by the existing hate speech provision, because almost invariably, either explicitly or implicitly, it is wrapped up in a set of claims or assumptions about Jews that could count as hate speech. So the real question is, what does this add? What does it add to talk about anti-Semitism? Is that a larger category than hate or not? I don't know. And generally speaking, what is that? I did want to take one quick issue with Joanna. I don't think that the earlier Zundel case really resolves that. I mean, that was ultimately decided on the basis of a particular antiquated law that had never been employed, the false news provision, at least in Canadian criminal code history, and the court found that law to be too vague. But I don't think that directly addresses the question of whether or not there can be a prohibition against Holocaust denial.
Joanna, I'm going to let you respond to that. And also, can you address the issue of, is Holocaust denial inherently different from hate speech? Is it a different category, or is it just a different form of hate speech that's already criminalized?
Yeah, so I actually agree with your comments, Professor Moon. I agree that Zundel doesn't resolve this. It was a different law at issue. I was just citing McLaughlin's comments about what the scope of Section 2B is, and just her comments that generally repugnant speech is covered under Section 2B, but I agree it was a totally different law. Also in Keegstra, you have Dixon saying things like, actually, sometimes repugnant speech serves the interests of democracy because it is in the clash of repugnant views and the truth that that discourse emerges. I don't know if I ever want to say that Holocaust denial has a constructive purpose, so I won't go that far. In terms of the other question about what this is adding, I share Professor Moon's question. Is this creating a new offense for Holocaust denial or downplaying that is not hateful against Jews? Because if that's the case, then what it seems to be criminalizing is ignorance, which has inherent problems when you think about mens rea. If you're truly ignorant, then you don't have the right mindset to be committing a crime. And then furthermore, I would say in that case, the better remedy has to be some type of education, not the threat of imprisonment.
And of course, there's a big spending commitment in the budget on the education side, which has such an important role to play. I was recently in Washington, D.C., and I had the opportunity to visit the Holocaust Museum there. To our viewers, if you're ever in Washington, it's one of the most incredible memorials I've ever been to, and I recommend everybody go to it, because education is so important for understanding the history of the Holocaust. Joanna, Germany and other European countries have done this before. We've got about a minute and a half left in this segment. What has the experience in those countries been like with criminalizing Holocaust denial?
So in 2021, Germany recorded the highest data on anti-Semitic hate crimes since they've been collecting data on criminality, politically motivated hate crimes. Anti-Semitic incidents rose by 75% in France in 2021. And I couldn't find a statistic for Belgium, but I did find one article saying that 39% of Belgian Jews in 2020 felt threatened or had been harassed and didn't feel comfortable, wearing kippas or other markers of their identity. So very depressing statistics.
And my understanding is that incidents of anti-Semitism in Canada have also been on the rise. Is that correct as well?
Yes.
And so I certainly understand sort of the thinking behind this bill, but if the speech is already criminalized in these other countries, sort of begs the question of if it has been effective in those countries in stemming rising anti-Semitism, and perhaps a different solution might yield better results. We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a recent proposal to add denying the Holocaust to the criminal code. Professor Moon, I was recently watching a Senate committee hearing on this issue. Joanna was one of the people presenting on that committee, but there was also Kara Zwiebel from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and she articulated some concerns around potential unintended consequences of adding this crime to the criminal code. Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, I think a couple of quite different concerns. So one of them is Holocaust denial. We have an idea of what that is, and we generally understand it as someone who is motivated by a desire to completely deny this fundamental wrong that was perpetrated against the Jews in Europe by the Nazis. But to talk about downplaying and other sorts of verbs like that, one doesn't kind of know how large or that category might be. And of course, there are the very cynical individuals like Ernst Zundel who knew exactly what he was doing when he denied the Holocaust. And then there are a lot of less sophisticated people who pick up and buy into sort of stupid ideas and express them in vague ways. Would this law extend to them? I have no idea. And the other thing that I'm struck by, of course, is the problem we've seen in other contexts, and that is different groups, of course, in our community understand that fundamental wrongs have been perpetrated against them. So one talks about and can think about the Armenian genocide or the Holodomor, for example, or the genocide against Indigenous peoples in Canada, in fact. Will there be some understandable desire for other groups to say, me too, we ought to be included in some way because wrongs were committed against us without denying the singularity of the Holocaust? So I think these are a couple of things I could imagine being concerns or fallout.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue, Joanna. Do you think that there is some argument that, today it's a proposal to ban Holocaust denial, but next year we could criminalize, have the government criminalize some other speech that is maybe disagreeable or objectionable, but maybe subject to more debate or more questions. I mean, there's no question about the Holocaust, but there's other contentious social issues and contentious histories in our country that may be subject to more debate. Do you foresee that being an issue?
I don't want to speculate. I think we're talking about Holocaust right now, and I do think it's singular. One point that Kara Zwiebel from the CCLA raised at committee that I thought was a very important point was that criminalizing Holocaust denial raises the specter of having to relitigate the historical record on the Holocaust. If somebody is actually charged under this provision, they will bring in defense, and the government will have the burden of proof. And it could also feed into conspiracy theories by demonstrating how the government is wanting to control the narrative. And so I think we should really think through practically how this would be enforced and what we would have to do to open this up for enforcement.
Yeah, we certainly wouldn't want our courts to be used as a platform for giving these conspiracy theories a platform in the courts, literally. So I do share that concern as well. Professor Moon, one of the things that struck me was that there is this carve out in the proposal not to criminalize Holocaust denial if it's done in private. what can you say about that, and if what your thoughts are on if that would be an effective carve-out?
Well, I mean, the existing criminal code provision concerning hate speech does prohibit willful promotion of hatred other than in private conversation. So that is something we're already familiar with. And it's really meant just to limit, I suppose, what we might understand to be the intrusiveness of the law into more intimate family, friendship conversations. And so it's understandable, which is not to say that hatred can't be spread. In fact, often is in those relationships precisely, but they don't have the same public visibility and the same concern. So I think that's understandable. I think courts have had to contend with that exception before. I was just going to pick up something Joanna said before. I don't know whether a court would do this, but in the Zundel case, which was about Holocaust denial, there was, in fact, effectively initially a litigating of whether or not the Holocaust occurred, although a court of appeal later said the trial court ought to have taken judicial notice of the Holocaust as a historical fact so that it was not the subject of litigation. The only issue would have been whether Zundel knew that what he was saying was false, and a jury found that.
That makes sense. We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a new proposal to criminalize Holocaust denial. Joanna, let me start with you. What's your view on whether or not this law would pass constitutional scrutiny if it were challenged?
So it would be challenged. It would be on its face a violation of Section 2B. And I don't think that it would pass constitutional scrutiny because given what we've already spoken about, that Section 319 already criminalizes hate speech, which incites violence against Jews or is hateful to Jews, is already criminalized. I'm not sure what the pressing and substantial objective is. If the overriding objective is to curb anti-Semitism, nobody has been able to point to any underlying mechanism by which the proposed amendments would actually do that. And I think they would have a hard time demonstrating that.
Professor Moon, same question to you. What is your view on whether or not, if this law were challenged in court, if it would be upheld as constitutional?
Yeah, Joanna makes a good point because one take on this might be, well, it's redundant, and therefore, why is it necessary? I suspect, however, that the court would uphold it. Of course, it is the way the court frames these issues, a breach of Section 2B, the freedom of expression provision of the Charter, and then they go on to Section 1 and consider whether it's justified. And generally speaking, when courts address laws like this under Section 1, in advance, they often try to give an interpretation to the law to potentially narrow its scope if it might be perceived as too broad or to clarify certain terms. And I suspect that's probably what would occur and occur in such a way that the court felt comfortable upholding the law under Section 1 on the same basis they've upheld hate speech laws previously.
Professor Moon, there has been some discussion of bringing back a civil remedy for hate speech through human rights tribunals. This is something you've written about in the past, done a big report on this. What's your view on, and there is a proposal to potentially bring them back. So what's your view on that, and if that remedy could address Holocaust denial?
Well, so yes, I wrote a report on it quite a few years ago and recommended, in fact, the repeal of the existing provision for a variety of reasons that we don't have time for me to go into here. But when I wrote that report, it was quite a different environment. It was pre-social media, really. I mean, social media was just starting. And it really is the case now that most hate speech is really circulating on different social media platforms. And I don't really think that the Canadian Human Rights Commission is really in a position to be able to assess and make judgments about the huge volume of hateful stuff that circulates online, even though they've been given under this new proposal certain powers they didn't previously have to investigate and to filter out claims that they don't think have real merit to begin with. So I think it's mostly a public relations matter that we're trying to do something. Ultimately, the meaningful action will be action that's directed towards social media platforms themselves, requiring them to take down this material in a certain period of time. And those have a lot of issues, raise a lot of concerns as well, which we can talk about another time.
Joanna, what's your view on this? I mean, basically, what is the best way to address this issue of Holocaust denial, if not through criminalizing it?
So I think all we can do is focus on education. And it occurs to me when thinking about the so-called private exemption, if we're going to ban this speech in public we're just going to drive it underground. Isn't it better to have it out in the open so that we can know who these people are, know what they're discussing, know what they're getting tripped up on? And if it does start to lead into violent or incitement territory, not only is that only criminalized, but we can be aware of it.
I definitely agree. I think, and there are many resources out there for people to learn about the history of the Holocaust, including the National Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C., and Canada also has a national memorial. I encourage everyone to go and learn about this really important part of human history. I want to thank you both so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
We've heard today about a new federal proposal to criminalize Holocaust denial. Half of my family is Jewish, and I would do anything to protect them from the vileness of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial being one of the worst forms. Holocaust denial is a terrible lie that our society must shut down. Should it be criminalized too? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Geyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.